he added some notes to Bach. In the first piece, I played a prelude in the style of Bach. The word preludieren in German is a word like, we don't really have a verb form in English. It would be to preludize, but that word was used in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries for keyboardists when they had to prepare sort of in an improvisatory way, get to know the instrument or let the congregation or the choir know what key they were going to sing in. And so preludieren was a common thing that preceded sometimes a more contrapuntally sophisticated work. So as Johann Sebastian Bach did in the Well-Tempered Clavier, he put a prelude before a fugue. So I put a prelude before an invention. And the way I treated the invention was as if it were a concerto grosso, and I was adding a continuo part. This invention in F major has always reminded me of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto in F major. So what I did was I added a continuo part, what a keyboardist would do. And then that, of course, means that I had to deduce what the harmonies were of the invention. So I put basically a chord pattern and treated it as if this were a concerto grosso in F, and I'm the harpsichordist. Of course, in real life, the continuo player is not really heard that much. It's mostly in the background. So this was a big difference in dynamics. But this was something inspired by what Johann Sebastian Bach himself might have done. You know that he would often add lines to pre-existing polyphonic compositions. One time he made a 5-voice texture, and Caldara's Magnificat, he turned it into a 7-voice texture. I don't know if it was on the spot, but he did it. Or he would be playing a trio sonata, which normally has 2 melodic lines, and he would add a 3rd melodic line. So anyway, this is an example of what I'm going to do in this presentation. So the C major prelude by Bach from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, is a very inviting piece to add lines to. Gounod composed his famous Ave Maria, and I'm sure that what I'll do here also will resemble what Gounod did, but it's not because I'm imitating him, it's just that we have the same chord pattern. If you have this chord pattern, then you're going to have similar melodic material. But this is the sort of thing that I'm sure Bach would have done many times. So prelude with an added line. In Bach's C minor partita in the first movement, at the end of the second section, there's an opportunity to improvise at a cadential 6/4. The section that I'm talking about begins in C minor, but by the end of this second section, he modulates to G minor. So obviously when I got to the C sharp diminished seventh chord, I put in a different kind of improvisatory flourish. What Bach wrote isn't bad. tradition in Bach's day would have been at a large cadential 6/4 to have an improvisatory flourish. Mozart was not the first person to invent cadenza at a cadential 6/4. There's a long tradition going back to Bach and before. So in that Sinfonia, I made two little changes. One is a Durchgang or passageway at the 5/6/4. And the other one was the addition of a little codetta with the insertion of a deceptive cadence. Secondary dominant 5/6/3 of 6, secondary of the submedian. The use of a deceptive cadence is very useful for improvisation. There were several kinds of deceptive cadences. We think of it going from 5 to 6, the submedian, but there are several other kinds of deceptive cadences, as in Handel's opera Xerxes, the aria Ombra mai fu, towards the end. Handel goes from 5 to a 4 chord in the first inversion. And Bach in the C-sharp minor prelude from the first book has this cadence. Goes from 5 to 7 diminished 7 of 5, and then has a little extension. And I think I'm going to do something similar in the D minor invention. So Bach had already put a deceptive cadence. prelude, going from to a diminished seventh chord. So if Bach can use that kind of deceptive cadence and have a kind of little codetta, I think it's appropriate. That would be an appropriate place to consider adding a new insertion into Bach's works. So in that minuet, I obviously made some variants, small variants on the reprise of the first minuet. And of course, I tried to follow Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's admonition in his Versuch über die Wahrheit das Klavier zu spielen. He said, in a kind of schoolmarmish way, make sure that you don't vary the reprise too much, because then it will alter the original composition. So I tried to be conservative and in good taste to follow C.B. Bach's specifications. And now to the B-flat major prelude from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Let me play my variant. changes in the prelude. Instead of doing 30-second notes, I tripletized that figure. Maybe that's a way of making it simpler. Also, when I got to this passage, which is a sort of an improvisatory passage, I added different secondary dominants. Instead of going, I went, I think. That's a G minor. So I had the same rhythmic structure, but I changed the chords. But I did end on the same note that Bach ends. So those are my variants with those two B-flat pieces. So a few words now about the very concept of improvisation. Of course, improvisation doesn't mean that you're inventing a language on the spot. Improvisation has always been a mixture of tricks, tropes, motifs, traditions. I think one of the easiest ways is to think about the riffs that jazz artists use. There is hardly a Charlie Parker solo that doesn't include that kind of a lick. The same with John Coltrane. If you were to compare his recording of Giant Steps, he will use this lick. Actually, he uses it in several choruses, so he's taking the same lick and reusing it. And I think that all improvisers have a reservoir of, I don't know if you call them tricks or tropes or conventions, motifs. If I have a diminished seventh chord, I can always arpeggiate it. I can do little triplets. I can also, if I have I can do, or instead of, I can do, which is like a Schleife. So these conventions are also based, of course, upon knowing harmony. Harmony is the basis of improvisation. In fact, most treatises on improvisation in Italy in the 17th century were basically harmony treatises, teaching kids to do, oh, that sounds like the prelude in C major. So these chord patterns, the proper realization of figured bass, proper voice leading, that was an essential part of being able to improvise. And of course, my sources for this are numerous. C.P. Bach is one good beginning place. The Versuch über die Wahrheit, das Klavier zu spielen, the essay on the true art of playing the piano or playing the keyboard. And he has a chapter on improvisation, on the free fantasia, how to do that. Because every organist was expected to know how to improvise a fantasia, a prelude, to improvise on a chorale. Some of my other favorite sources, early sources, are Johann Mattheson, who was a contemporary of Bach, who wrote about how an organist should prepare to improvise fantasia, and Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg, who was a generation after Bach, who also talked about the how organists have to prepare to learn how to improvise. And Andreas Werkmeister, he wrote a treatise in 1698 called Orgelprobe, which was essentially a manual to help organists with their auditions. And in the one of the chapters, he talks about how organists will certainly have to be able to improvise on a chorale, improvise a free fantasia. And he says some organists may actually pick a beer song or a French chanson or a bourrée on which to improvise. He's kind of saying in a demeaning way, as if those are not valuable, but in a way that reference to organists playing beer songs reminds me of the discussion of the sacred and the secular as talked about by John Eliot Gardner in his great book, his great biography of Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven, when he's talking about how the St. Thomas Kirche in Leipzig was at the far end of the sanctuary. You found women sniffing tobacco, young men sleeping, people reading newspapers, dogs wandering around, which was the same atmosphere that you would find at a coffee house down the block or a wine tavern. So the merging of the secular, or the interrelation between the secular and the sacred. And of course I have to mention Christoph Wolff's book, which in a way is the complement of John Eliot Gardner. His Only Facts, very straight, and this one is, John Eliot Gardner is filled with anecdotes that go way off topic. Oh, and if I have so many books to talk to you about. Robert Donington, the new Bach reader. This is all the documents of Bach. Oh, I should have mentioned this too, this very little known book by Charles Masson, which was written in the late 17th century, called Nouveau Traité des Règles pour la composition de la musique, which was published several places in Paris and Amsterdam, and probably in Germany too. So it's possible that Bach actually knew this book, in which he talks about improvisation, as well as how to realize ornaments from a figured bass, or to realize the chords of a figured bass. And of present day publications, this book by Pamela Rieter Feenstra, Bach and the Art of Improvisation, actually 2 volumes, is very helpful, very useful. And I have to mention this book by John Mortensen called The Pianist's Guide to Historic Improvisation, filled with a lot of useful exercises that are fundamental in cultivating the skills necessary to be an improviser. So this presentation has been about interacting with the score in a creative way, in the same way that Bach did. Johann Sebastian Bach was always transposing, rearranging, adding lines, recontextualizing his and others' music. So that's what, that is a skill that modern day keyboardists somehow, in our age of Urtext, Werkzeuge mentality, we tend to avoid it. But the creative interaction with the text is something that I think is a necessary skill to make the music come alive in the way that it was first created. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on playing with Bach, and I invite you to contact me if you have comments or questions. Thank you.